صباح الخير للجميع or مساء الخير للجميع, depending on where you are. My name is Lateral. Welcome to Psychic Militancy. Before we get started, please like, subscribe, send to a comrade, let folks know that this dream team is having this conversation. I'm very excited to have these comrades here, some of the most principled anti-imperialist scholars and thinkers out there. Helyeh will hopefully be joining us very soon. She's based in Iran and is trying to connect. But thankfully, Bikrum and Alex are here to help us kick this off. And I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. I wanted these folks here today to talk about empire's problem with sovereignty. And if you're not following Bikrum on Instagram, I think it's the Sovereignty Scholar, right, Bikrum?
That's right.
That's right.
And to the point.
Exactly. Yeah, we're not sort of cutting corners here. That's exactly what he does. And then Alex has a new piece about Mexican sovereignty. So, and then Helyeh has spoken a lot about Iranian sovereignty. So I'm hoping that this conversation will just get to the heart of it. Certainly, it feels like every day something happens and we're in a new place and a new space in general. So I just wanted to kind of start with checking in with you both, where you're at. Where do you want to locate us? Where do we start? There's a lot of problems that empire has with sovereignty. So I'm just going to kick it off to you to get us started.
Well, maybe I can just follow up on some things you just said there, just to start with, like on Helyeh in particular, just for folks to know that I think she's traveled to, to Minab, where the massacre had happened. And I think like obviously the connection is not so good there, but I think that's very significant. Maybe something to hold on to. And I had mentioned this the other day on Adnan's show as well, but I think, as we think about where we are in this moment, and, people are throwing around a very grand term, which is accurate. We're in a very world historical moment, which means we're in an epochal moment, right? We're at a moment which we've known since Al-Aqsa, like Sinwar's vision there was, nothing will be the same because everything will be exposed. Everything is exposed and the blinders cannot come back on. And so everything is changing and we are at an inflection point, and we can see the Islamic Republic is poised. There's a vacuum we're seeing, and it's poised to be filled by something else. We are seeing the lineaments of a post-imperialist world in real time. But I would say, Helyeh being in Minab right now, I mentioned this the other day, we have to hold two times. This is something I would insist that kind of we begin with, is we have to hold two, right? We have to hold a time that we're too late, that there's a lateness to everything. There's a lateness to everything because Minab should have never happened, right? Minab is not a precondition for the fall of US imperialism. As much as we quote Ho Chi Minh saying, the Vietnamese will be sovereign and free because we're willing to die 1,000 of us to one of you. And we understand that the world is being built this way, but neither should we accept that had to be the case. Neither should we accept and come to terms at the cost of victory that those lives we can forget. So I would just ask maybe people watching, and maybe because of the focus of this podcast, what would it mean to like have a set of practices every day when you get up to actually force yourself to remember the martyrs, like every single day? So whether that's Minab, whether that's in Gaza, what images did we see in Gaza that are just haunting today? Those mothers reuniting with their children who were taken out of the hospital in Gaza 2 years ago. Can we imagine this world actually existed where they haven't seen their children ever, like for 2 years? There's one young child who was separated from their mother in Gaza, whose sibling died the day she was born. And then imagine for 2 years not there, and now they're being reunited, and it's a moment of joy and a promise, like we're seeing, of what can come. But I think neither should we forget what has been and what could have been otherwise. So I think that's something I'm feeling like very strongly right now. Is in every instance, right? And we're looking at Lebanon, like what's happening with the massive displacement and the indignity that are forced upon a dignified people who are withstanding and practicing Samud. So like, how do we keep those two times together, right? Because sovereignty, as we'll understand, has two edges to it. So sovereignty has, I guess, multiple edges to it, but maybe there's two, right? There's an internal component to sovereignty that there's a quality to it. There's a qualitative edge to sovereignty. right? Which is the relations that we forge with one another and the land that grants the will with which people defend who they are, their identity and their land. But a part of that today is not forgetting the martyrs, right? That has to feed into the qualitative basis of any sovereign project. There's a quantitative one too. And then there's another level to sovereignty, which is there's the internal basis, but there's external relations we forge across difference, which then reshapes who we are, right? But the acts of remembrance will be pivotal in whatever world is to come. So, yeah, sorry, that was a lot maybe to open with.
Oh, to the contrary. I mean,
yeah.
This is exactly why I wanted you all on here. To the contrary, it's never too much. I mean, I feel like you're already sort of inviting us, maybe pushing us, challenging us to wonder and think and commit to a political project of how do we radically redistribute responsibility of who takes the price, who always pays the price for this. And as we're building this new world, like bringing this world into being, who are the peoples of the world that always take the responsibility for that? And what does it mean for us to join in that in practical ways, in praxis, in militancy, both in practice and then also psychically too, to not forget, even as we feel joy at the ways in which people are fighting back and resisting, that we understand the violence and the losses that are incurred as they do that. Alex, welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our comrades and even our enemies that I'm sure are tuning in because they love tuning into Lada's show. I really appreciate one. I mean, I've learned in the past and I continue to learn so much from both of you, and from Bikrum's work on sovereignty has been really instrumental in the way that I think about what sovereignty means in Latin America. And him and I we've had this conversation before. But I think the way you started us off, Bikrum, is really important because, right now I'm teaching a Latin American revolutions class. And yesterday we started on El Salvador in the 1970s and 80s. And I talked about the assassination of Archbishop, now Saint, but Archbishop Oscar Romero, as he was giving mass on March 24th, 1980. And he's become this outsized figure, political figure, cultural figure, religious figure in El Salvador and throughout Latin America. But then just recently I watched a press conference with the current dictatorial ruler of El Salvador, Bukele, and behind him was a massive portrait of Archbishop Oscar Romero, right? So we really do have to the fight for the martyrs continues in memory and something like Walter Benjamin talks about, right? Not even the dead are safe from the enemy. And I think we need to keep that in mind. I think Bikrum's exactly right. It's a really powerful invocation of how, even in a moment of victory, whatever victory can look like in the future, we still have to wage these memory battles for these martyrs that never should have died the way that they did, right? These schoolgirls should have never died the way that they did. Those young women who were practicing volleyball, who got experimented on with a new American missile, should have not died the way that they did, their coaches, et cetera. So I think and you see this, from my background in Latin American history, like the EZLN says, a people with a memory is a rebel people. And those martyrs allow us to continue to be rebels for those of us who remain living in the present and in the future. And we have a great responsibility to keep them alive, as Bikrum says, right? That's part of the struggle. That's not a disconnected struggle within these multiple facets of sovereignty, right? The different internal and external facets of it. But in the realm of memory and in the realm of history, we also have to continue to wage that battle.
Well, part of what you're both orienting us to is a continuous sort of connection to the condition and the structure that made the possibility for them to be martyred in that way to begin with, right? That I think if we're sort of just looking at what's happening in this moment right now, we might miss the structural pieces. When Bikrum, when you kicked us off and said it actually didn't have to be this way, there's also a way in which you are asking us to think, and this is what you just said, Alex, too, about what are the reconfigurations of the world individually and structurally and in our movements that would make it such that the condition itself could not be possible. The condition for genocide to happen could not be possible. The condition in which sanctions against Iran or Cuba or Venezuela or, again, long list, could not happen. The conditions in which the empire does not function in the way that it does, whether at home or abroad. So I'm really appreciative, actually, that that's where we kicked off right away. Did you want to say something, Bikrum?
Well, I mean, so you're saying like it orients towards what conditions would be necessary for this not to happen, right? And so I think that is also a really important point of departure, and it actually it links the two regions in a broad historical way, in a sense, right? Because there's a way in which I have been somewhat frustrated with, increasingly so, in recognition, of course, of important work that, say, somebody like Francesca Albanese has been doing, right? But I find that there's a position that remains trapped, that doesn't allow us to get to that question that you just posed. What are the conditions so this doesn't happen? Should those who suffer this and are exposed to this be beggars, begging for their rights, begging for international law to enforce something? Because what has been on the table in the history of capitalist imperialism, okay, like from the 16th century till today, is anything is possible, but it's not. But anything is possible, they tell us, under their sun, right? That there's an indigenous thinker, Philippe Guamin de Poma, I think, one of the earliest sort of articulations of a somewhat sovereign vision, right? Like, and he argues like that the Spanish had created a world in reverse. That the sun should not be the Spanish sun. It's an indigenous sun. You are guests in our territory. But under their sun, like Las Casas and them would say, we can recognize your culture. We can feel your pain. Las Casas feels very sorry. But one thing that is unforgivable, that they will never allow for the imperialists, is the question that you posed. How do you actually transform the conditions that make this possible? Which is the sovereignty question, right? So how do you actually build a power that can say, no, you do not have the right to take our resources in this way. You do not have the right to attack us with impunity. At that scale, international law has held, an international law backed by Western imperialism, it has held that the moment at which the colonized violate that rule, when they take up arms, when they build an economic model that can prevent that sort of genocidal violence, this sort of impunity, that is the moment in which they hold that you can be sanctioned. Okay, so again, I've mentioned this before, but if you look at in the history of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, who has been sanctioned? The Haitians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, the Venezuelans. What is each state have in common? They have violated this question, right? They have sought to put in place the conditions that would prevent the possibility for that type of eliminationist violence, for this type of slaughter, for this type of immiseration, for this type of surplus value appropriation. That is what's unforgivable. Now, if you do not contest at that scale, they'll tell you anything is possible. We'll send NGOs to you, right? We'll offer you the world, but it's an enslaved world, right? It's an undignified life that is put on offer. So I think that is the question, because then somebody like Albanese, who thinks that she's doing something for Palestinians, but in every instance delegitimizes those who put that question on the table, those who argue that we want the conditions in our hands. We don't want to be beggars, like the Islamic Republic, like Hamas, like Hezbollah. If you are constantly condemning them, then you are condemning the people for which they fight for to a condition of subservience eternally, right? And I think that's the moment we're in, that the Palestinians have forced on us and Iran has forced on us. Because shame on us that we came up after the Cold War ended as scholars, and we started buying into this stuff in that decolonial turn. We started buying into this by thinking that it was power that was the problem, right? By thinking that what was needed was just a focus on knowledge or whatever, right? So I think I would really agree with you, and we can get more into the details on some of that in terms of, like, say, with the Islamic Republic or what's happening today.
Yeah, I'd love to get more into the nitty-gritty details, but I think part of what you, just to sort of extend what you're saying, is all of these examples that you've given are folks who refuse to bend to the normalization of liberal humanist values, right? There's a way in which they are militantly refusing the lie and the myth that actually continues that condition, that continues the possibility that this violence can be waged in a particular way, while at the same time engaging in sort of social and relational and political processes that fundamentally are coercive. And they're fundamentally coercive because they demand a concession up front. They demand all the ways in which what you're talking about, what constitutes sovereignty or self-determination, actually be given up up front. And that's a piece of normalization. I think we think in the context of Palestine, this word normalization is constantly thrown around. But if we can think about it in that way, it normalizes a particular social order in which the hierarchy of coercion and power remains the same, but under the guise of like an innocent, like we're doing something differently, right? But I think, Alex, you probably have a lot more to say about this too.
Well, I mean, it creates almost it creates a loop, right? Like if we look at this, like, and this is one of the things that I appreciate from Bikrum's work, like he takes a long historical perspective, right? Takes us back more than 500 years. It creates this loop, right? Where the peoples of like the Americas who have original sovereignty to the lands, whether it's in what is now the United States or different parts of Latin America, they had the right to say, you don't belong here at all, right? To the Europeans who arrived. And then the Europeans arrive and they systematically have set up an international system that Albanese is a part of, where for peoples who are struggling to achieve meaningful sovereignty, their struggle is always not even the struggle to have rights, is the struggle for the right to have rights. But those rights are framed within like the imperialist colonizer framework. We can call it international law, we can call it whatever we want, but if we do a deep dive into the histories of this legal international framework, we know who created these laws, right? We know why these laws were created and at what moment they were created. So it always straitjackets peoples who are resisting in this framework, right? So it's the right to have rights. And then once you obtain, if you're successful, again, depending on how you define that, you're still caught within this framework, right? And this is why someone like Albanese or other people who live in that world, their critique stops at a certain moment, right? It's the moment where most liberal critiques will stop. Do these people have a natural right to resist tyranny and oppression with whatever means are necessary? And this is this is like this legal theory goes back to the 13th, 14th century, right? That the idea that peoples have an innate or a natural right to resist tyranny in whatever way they see fit to actually get rid of that tyranny. Except as we know, who has that right has always been conditioned by imperialism and colonialism. And this is what we see today. So you can critique Zionism, you can critique the genocide in Gaza, but can you make that next leap forward and say, these people actually do have a natural right to resist tyranny via armed struggle, because that's the only way to get rid of colonialism, as Brother Fanon would tell us? Are we able to go that route, right? And in certain contexts, us going into that route is criminal, right? We can get in trouble, right? There could be legal proceedings waged against us simply for repeating a quote unquote natural right that has been granted to settlers, that has been granted to Europeans in a variety of different contexts. But when it applies to certain individuals, to certain natives, to certain indigenous populations, that's always a foreclosed possibility. And to even bring it up, we can suffer certain legal repercussions depending on where we live and what part of the world we're at. So again, so these struggles are reduced to a bare minimum, the right to have rights. And then we're still caught in that legalistic international rights framework that misses the point. The point is, and this is what the question of sovereignty really brings up. The question is, do peoples have a right to have self-determination at multiple levels, at the personal, at the individual, at the regional, and at the national level? And what does it take to protect that sovereignty? And for those of us who call ourselves comrades of these struggles or who are in solidarity with these struggles, do we go to that length, right? Do we go to that logical conclusion, or do we stop at, within a United Nations international human rights limit, right? That seems to be the limit of international human rights to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
This is going to be a challenging program because you guys are making me think way too much. And I was just listening to Alex and I was like trying to keep up with everything. So that's very generative. So the right to have rights. I think I really think this is important. And it's kind of reminding me in a different way though. And also maybe before I forget, Lara, if we can come back to Fanon, that'd be great, because I think this show is a really unique way to cut into Fanon. The way you've titled it, Psychic Militancy, I think there's a really unique way we can come back to different elements of Fanon.
We can always come back to Fanon.
Okay. But Ghassan Kanafani, he has this really not haunting but powerful, I think, like sentence, like he often does, that cuts to the heart of things, where the right to have rights, Alex, like kind of funny, he says like the Palestinians are forced to live in a world, and I'm quoting him, like obviously I'm not Palestinian, but like he says, in a world that is not ours, so in a world that is not theirs. So you see, like, when in this, what does it mean to say you're forced to live in a world that is not yours? Okay, so now the colonizer can recognize your clothing perhaps and say, hey, look, I like your indigenous cloth. And they might recognize your dance. But the question we can ask, who are you dancing for? Who are you on stage? And the question is of recognition. And that's a question of sovereignty, how we recognize one another. But do you dance and do you put on your clothing to be recognized by the colonizer? Are you dependent on them for recognition? And there's nothing wrong with mutual recognition, right? But is it as a recognition that feeds your resources into building their society? Is it a dependent development path? And what exactly is being built? It's Epsteinism. So you see, in a world that is not ours, in a world that does not produce the meaning of, say, Palestinian life in historic Palestine, but instead there's a draining of energy and resources from Palestinian life, right? Directed towards Zionism, directed towards colonialism and imperialism. And what type of life is that, right? It's an unrestrained, unregulated, immoral, unethical life that prioritizes pleasure over anything deeper, right? So I think like the right to have rights is the right to produce a world that is yours, right? To recycle your energy and your resources into a different form of life, into a different type of meaning. And it's also, though, to reassert, and I've been talking about this recently, is to reassert power over death too, right? Like a pivotal question of sovereignty is the state of exception. Who has the power to say law no longer applies here? Who has the power of life and death? Now, the colonizer promises the colonized civilization, right? They promise everything, but they hold that, like Kanafani says, a sword in the neck. They hold that over you at every instance, right? Now, so what does it mean to wrestle that back? On what terms? Well, then you have to meet the sword with a sword, right? And Alex, you're right. That is the place we're not allowed to go to. And Laura, I mentioned this when we met at the conference in Vancouver. You know, as people have been congratulating themselves, saying, hey, we did it. We beat Zionism in our academic spaces. We don't go to this space that Alex said. The space that would allow for a world that is ours, that would actually remove the condition of being a beggar or being dependent on recognition from the Epsteinisms, right? We're not allowed to say Sinwar's name in a conference, okay? Think about the political theory of Yahya Sinwar, how actually we are so dependent on it today, how so little would have been possible absent the exposure of the world in this way. So there's that element, but I think today what I would say is everything is possible right now. I really want people to feel that everything is possible. You know, like I'm asking this question a lot, what are people seeking to protect right now? And if you stand together in relations of mutual recognition, everything is possible to overcome this, because we see the Islamic Republic, and I don't mean to keep coming back to this, but it's on the verge of a historic victory. It's poised to fill a vacuum. So everything can be possible, but it's on us to be able to understand that we need to recognize the other. We need to recognize the colonized in a location of power as well. Everything is possible. We have to move beyond this colonial intelligibility that can only see them as children or victims, right? So, and even for ourselves, what does that mean? So I know all of us have experience, and we don't have to name the haters, right? Because we have common haters amongst us all, but we choose not to talk about how we receive death threats or that we've lost our jobs, right? Maybe maybe people don't know. Maybe we have lost our jobs, maybe we have. But what does it mean to not give in to that too? At this moment, to say that's not going to be what matters for us, right? At this moment, there's something else possible. And if we collectively stand together in a position of power with the remembrance of the martyrs, then we can raise up that necessary force and take away, we disarm them. What does it mean to disarm the oppressor? It says what you threaten to take away, we can withstand that, right? To the very limit, which may be death, right? Which is what the resistance, the axis, really centers upon.
Absolutely. I mean, I think both of you already are sort of talking about the trap of legibility, right? That like to go back to Fanon, if we want to sort of root ourselves there, when he talks about the colonized will always, it's a reallocation of guilt. It's a racialized reallocation of guilt. And if that is our fundamental starting point, ceding no space, refusing to cede space from the get-go, not as an after effect, but also to sort of be honest about the fact that at this point in time, there has been many attempts at compromises over many decades, if not centuries. And this is the moment that we're at right now, right? Where ceding any more space is actually, we can see what the fruit of that was, that we are at a different moment where ceding no space is necessary. So the right to have rights becomes, that Alex was saying, becomes part of a way of us to be aware of the trap that we're being seduced into, because that shit doesn't work. It never works because of the framework, because of the parameters in which it's in, because of the fact that the colonizer sets it up such that you can't get out of it. But there's another demand there. It means if you sort of refuse legibility in the eyes of the colonizer, what are you also committing to yourself? What are the ways that we are committing to in solidarity? Alex was saying earlier, and you too, Bikrum, is like in solidarity with those folks, is to ask this question, because it's not about shaming us. It's about to understand the ways in which these disciplinary and carceral regimes get lodged inside of us to stop us from making comments that, by the way, should not be controversial. Like, why wouldn't we be talking about Sinwar? Why wouldn't we be talking about Hezbollah? Why wouldn't we be talking about Hamas? Why wouldn't we be talking about any anti-colonial struggle that's happening? I think this is what we're learning, whether it's from Gaza or Lebanon or Iran, about what does it mean actually to refuse entirely to make any concessions. So anytime we see a spokesperson from Iran on whether it's on news shows or on their massive trolling Twitter, which is great, that's another version of this, is really the sort of leaning into moving away from all the ways in which concessions were the precondition before. And right now, if we're living in a different world, if we have been living in a different world since Tawafan al-Aqsa, then there's also a way in which resistance, people who are active in the resistance are rising to that challenge and saying, it's not enough that we started a new world. What does it mean to actually commit to that every single day? And I think that's a question for us. I mean, that's a question I have for you all, is that as you're talking about this, the trap of legibility, all these sorts of things, maybe this is the nitty-gritty details. Okay, so what are some of the ways we do that? I mean, I often talk about who are you identifying with, and who then, of course, are you coercively disidentifying from? What does it mean to sort of insert Sinwar's name, even as a disruption to our internal carceral regime that's lodged inside of us? What does it mean to normalize this conversation rather than shy away from it? But I'd love to hear from you all the ways that you are doing that. What are some of the specifics that you're talking about? These are the details that, Bikrum, you alluded to, you wanted to get into, but I'm really excited to hear from both of you.
I mean, I think in the entrails of the belly of the beast, I think we have a lot of political education to do. I mean, I think so. Like, going back to what Bikrum said, like, what conditions, and you too, Lada, like, what preconditions and conditions allowed for a world to exist where, you can assassinate from the air 168 school children in Iran. I keep coming back to this story. I'm sure you guys saw this too a couple weeks ago. The story about the Palestinian baby who was tortured by Israeli soldiers to extract information from their parents, right? Like burning cigarettes. Like what kind of, thinking about conditions, right? What kind of world tolerates the putting out of cigarettes on the skin on the leg of a 1-year-old Palestinian child? And as someone who does, who focuses on like Cold War Latin America, that type of violence is very similar to what these proxy regimes, dictatorial authoritarian regimes in Latin America, that's similar types of violence that they enacted against their own populations, who had used a variety of different forms of resistance to just, again, the right to have rights, the right to not be killed, their right to not be tortured, their right to have a dignified life, to get a just return for their labor, to have a home, to have access to education, medical care, et cetera, they suffered that terrible type of torture. So part of like what I see my work here is to politically educate an American population, a US population that for the most part has been blissfully unaware, again, of the type of conditions that makes their own world possible. It is based on so much suffering and violence and torture and enforced disappearances and the systematic murder of migrants who are trying to cross into the United States, whether it's through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, through the Sonoran Desert. Like, part of it's just like so basic. Like, this is what happened. This is what your government has done. This is a history of sovereignty. This, as we've learned from our compa Nick Estes, this goes back to the very beginning of this history, right? And one way we can think about U.S. empires, to think about it waging global Indian wars for like 3 centuries, right? Which is something that I've learned a lot from Nick's work. So part of this is just kind of like, can you provide the historical and the political coordinates for a population that has been so thoroughly indoctrinated in racism and Islamophobia and other types of ideological edifices that prevents them from seeing that the struggle of Palestinians for self-determination is a very human one. It has nothing to do with their particular differences or the way that they're imagined, their Orientalist, racist ways that they're represented and imagined in the United States. But it's part of that, the politics of mutual recognition that Bikram is talking about. So it's part of this is just like really basic political and historical education for the people who live inside the empire. I mean, we have the advantage of, something that Trump has done is provide a very stark contrast, right? Their ideological edifices are gone, right? This is what I think why it's effective to call them like the Epstein class. I know people like sometimes push back against Professor Morandi, and even you used it, Bikram, but it's like a very clarifying way to describe what power actually looks like in the United States, and then what that power is doing both internally with brutalizing people of color, waging an ethnic cleansing campaign against migrants, regardless of legal condition, and then the bombing and the horrific massacres that they're conducting abroad in West Asia or on the border of Ecuador and Colombia, or slowly strangulating a country like Cuba. So like they actually are making it easier for us, right? It's a very clear distinction. And the Iranian propaganda is really helping us too. I mean, those Lego AI movies are very clear about this. They know what they're doing. So so I think that's one thing that I think about a lot. That's
Sina.
Yes, Iran's embassies in East Africa have been going hard. I mean, the lines could not be any clear. Like there's a stark, clear division. Do we fight for we can say we want a better world, but it's not even that. I mean, I think that would be too presumptuous. It's a wager. We're fighting for a wager to have a better world, because that still will require struggle. Or the opposite is to support a world that depends on the torture of 1-year-old infants, on the murder of Palestinian babies who were in those incubators. That's what I keep coming back to. Maybe because I'm a parent, but so the lines to me couldn't be any starker right now, and it just involves us doing educating to a certain extent.
Yeah. I think on that question, I think this question of intelligibility, like how do we break out of that mold, right? And I think there's a way in which one thing I'd put on the table to begin with is, again, this is I don't mean to be like just picking on Albanese, but I think it's very instructive. I just think it's quite instructive, because to whom are we accountable? I think is one question we can begin with. From whom do we seek recognition, right? So it's very clear to me that she's trying to prove herself to somebody by continually condemning Iran. Who is she seeking recognition from? It's clearly not the resistance. She's clearly not seeking accountability to those who are holding herself accountable to those who are putting their lives on the line every day in the tunnels of Gaza, in the missile cities in Iran, right? So from whom do we seek mutual recognition, right? That is a question we can ask ourselves to begin with. To whom are we accountable? And I saw this last week. I was at the International Studies Association conference, my absolutely last one. I think this is the first place I announced it. I'm not going back. If you reject BDS after 2.5 years, no thank you. So to all my people who go to the ISA, I won't see you there next time. But I'll tell you, the presidential speech this year was given in such a way that it was more concerned about proving to the Anti-Defamation League that ISA is not anti-Semitic. Like that is what we become trapped with. And then to prove to them, then what is and is not intelligible. If I had to prove my humanity to the ADL by saying, well, I'm going to talk about the Holocaust for 30 minutes, but I'm going to talk about Palestine for 2 seconds. Okay. So that's one thing I would begin. That helps break us out of it, right? But another component, I think, is on this question of like mutual recognition. So other videos we've seen, the Lego videos from Iran, there's one that they had where they had indigenous people. I think they had Malcolm X, like a series of really prominent sites of struggle over centuries. Now that's a basis of a different form of mutual recognition, right? That's a basis very materially of those who have been on the underside of capitalist imperialism, coming together and recognizing one another and recognizing one another's humanity and steadfastness there. And, just like Marx would say, the lineaments of socialism are found on the shop floor. We can see the lineaments of a sovereign multipolar world, of a sovereign world of coexistence in that comical video they showed, right? But in how we encounter one another at those moments, right? Like when Malcolm X goes for Hajj and he sees that like there's actually commonality in the struggle. When Du Bois writes in Black Reconstruction, actually the struggle in the south of the US is the same as the struggle in China at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. There's a different world at hand there, and there's a different intelligibility, because no longer then do you seek recognition from them. No longer do you perform from them, right? That opens up something internally that can help you overcome a sense of shame or despair you may feel in your own history, because now you're getting these strengths through lateral relations with others, right? And I think there's something, though, that is a question to ask for those of us who grew up in the West, right? Who are here, because there's been a deferral, a constant deferment. So how what do I mean by this when it comes to how we understand and what we make intelligible and who we seek recognition from? So maybe to come back to Fanon here in a way, like Fanon, I think he really begins from the question of love. Okay, he begins from the question of love because that's what he's searching for, right? If it Black and White Masks, he says, "I love you." He starts by saying, I love you, my brothers, right? But then you can see this pain that we do not live in a world where love is actually possible in the way that Fanon is looking for love to be possible, right? Because of the relations of like mastery and impunity, okay? So that's why Fanon is saying, we're not trying to be white. We're not trying to go up to the clouds. We're trying to drag them back down to earth to remind them they bleed. They're of the soil, right? And that mutual vulnerability is where we'll find the conditions for real love, a world centered on the heart. So for Fanon, though, a key starting point, he has a really like provocative or a grand point in the middle of Black and White Masks where he says, in the beginning, there was a gift, right? Or something like this. In the beginning, there was a movement of the gift. And, we can think about this in relation to indigenous scholars like Glenn Coulthard, I think Leanne Simpson, others. They've talked about a gift-giving diplomacy. That you can have another world in which there's an encounter of difference. Societies encounter one another, and they don't have to encounter one another through a narrow realism necessarily, right, of projecting power to one another, but they can encounter one another through gift giving. Okay, so, and we can understand, again, going back, like Alex, to 5 centuries, right, when the Taino encountered the Spanish. There's a gift-giving mode of diplomacy that encounters what Fanon calls in that same paragraph, a mode of the gift encounters the mode of conquest. So when I encounter another, I can provision a gift of survival on my lands, and the other can respond in a shared vulnerability and recognize my sovereignty, or it can respond with a movement of conquest. And that's what the West has responded with. It's deferred, a reckoning with itself. It's deferred looking at its internal relations. It's deferred the land question that capitalism so violently dispossesses workers from. It's deferred attending to those in a just way. It's deferred those through this movement of conquest by trying to resolve and displace these questions through conquest, right? So even for people here in the core, a coming anti-imperialism can allow for a reorientation of mutual recognition on the basis of something like a gift-giving diplomacy, right? As Fanon is kind of gesturing towards, or others.
I love this. I think every time on this show we say Fanon, we should put like a resistance photo up or something and see and have the count happen. But I think, no, it's really important because part of what I think what you're both saying, and I remembered Leanne Simpson actually as well, because she has this beautiful sort of question in the book, What We've Always Done, about like what would happen if no one sided with colonialism. And that's not an abstract question. It means doing precisely what both of you are saying. So in your case, Alex, what you were sort of laying out is to continuously go back, again, like Fanon does, in an unbending truth-telling. And some of that is very painful, to look at the ways in which a child is tortured, but that doesn't happen in a vacuum. All the conditions in the infrastructure in which that can come into being, that could even be a possibility, that would be something that somebody reaches to, is precisely because the logics of settler colonialism allows for that to happen. Because while we are seeing that now and being horrified, rightfully so, that was also the beginning of the settler colony now known as Israel, right? In which people en masse are tortured, in which babies are displaced, in which mothers are killed, and babies can't be born, to what we're seeing post, of course, Tawfan al-Aqsa, to what we're seeing in Iran, or girls in schools being bombed. Like, that's the same question, but it does demand of us a continuous truth-telling and not looking away. And the truth-telling is not just, listing out a litany of violences, but locating it within the structure that allows those violences to happen, right? Because one of the things that pisses me off the most as a psychologist is like, everybody loves to talk about trauma, but nobody wants to link it up with like what causes the trauma to begin with. It's sort of the same way of like erasing Sinwar out of the room. Every psychologist wants to talk about the ways in which Palestinians are traumatized, but the second you start saying, well, here's the source of that trauma, actually, I can point exactly to the person, to the structure, to the state, to the settler condition that causes that, somehow there's a sort of turning away from it in the way that Albanese does as well. And I think that's the piece of it. So I think that also brings us into what you're saying, Bikrum, about, again, what does it mean to continuously ask this question? What if nobody sided with colonialism? So even in small ways, because I think sometimes we get wrapped up in, but these aren't givens, and we know this, and we say it, and imperialism is bad, or, we know that colonial logics are violent. But I think part of what you all are mapping out for us are all the small and big ways in which we are seduced away from that position, out of legibility, out of softening ourselves, out of, believing that somehow there's a way to reach, whether it's the colonizer or the liberals among us or anything like that. But I think one of the things we're seeing across the board is actually nothing other than holding the line. Or Brother Malcolm X, what he says is being an extremist and not being ashamed of it. Because, then the point of that is to say the thing that is called extremism is actually not extreme. It's actually the most basic position that we can take to answer back to this question that Leanne Simpson says is, what would happen if nobody sided with colonialism? That's a real question. What does it mean on a day-to-day basis? Maybe this is the affirmations that you were talking about, Bikram, of like reciting the martyrs. That's one way you don't get wrapped up in the settler colonial logics that would have us believe that somehow that was just a necessity, that their loss is just a necessity.
Well, I think when you were speaking, though, there's something I was thinking too, like in terms of what it would mean, to get up, to remember, right? But it's also to in that act of remembrance, there's a thing I think to attach it to, which it is to bring it back to that second time, right? So this act of remembrance, to say this to nobody, what would happen if nobody sided with colonialism, and to everyday remember. But then, as we remember with our hand on our heart, with the other fist, we put it in the sky, like Malcolm would say, right? And what does it mean to do that, though? It means to say that act of remembrance is also an act of re-empowerment. It is to say, again, and I think this is something that is really, really like, there's something that I think in intelligibility that is really hard for Western traditions that we all critique, but it's hard to break out of, right? I'm not even trying to put myself out of it. like Orientalism or something to grasp what the Islamic Republic is doing today, right? Because, you know, they will put on their missiles like, this is for the people of Gaza, this is for whatever. Like there's a concrete connection there, but they're also saying, you came to disarm us. You came to take away the possibility where Alex and you started, like with what are the conditions, right, that could stop this from happening. You Epsteinisms, and I think it's important. Epsteinism is important, and I know I'm rambling a little bit. I don't want to forget this one point, because capitalism at its purity is about unrestrained, unregulated life, right? It's about putting the immediate realization of profit and pleasure above everything else, right? And this is where we've ended up with. This is where we ended. Look at with the fall of the Soviet Union and with the capitalist crisis in the 70s, what emerges out of that? Epsteinism, right? It's like the final stage of capitalism almost, right? I mean, it's always been there though. I don't want to say it hasn't, because this has been it since the Spaniards arrive on the shores of the Caribbean, right? Like this has been their MO, right? The Epsteinism. But what do you see in Iran today? They're saying you came to disarm us from holding the conditions that could end this type of life of Epsteinism, of genocide, etc. But we are disarming you, because as we remember the martyrs, and they never should have died, but we're also saying we will not allow your ability to kill us to stop us. So you see, there's like a reverse disarming that's happened. It's not a disarmament like they take away Tomahawk missiles, although we can have that discussion because they are. Actually, there's something quite brilliant about the tunnel cities in Iran, and the question of the Shahid drone manufacture and how it's beyond the reach of imperialism. And we can go to a psychological question about the unseen there and say how there's a seen world and an unseen world. There's the tunnels within us and there's the tunnels underneath the struggle. But, they're disarming them. They are in a war of attrition, taking away their missiles and weight. But there's another type of disarming that's happening through an act of remembrance. So we remember every day, we refuse to forget, but it is a remembrance that is re-signifying death. It is locating death within a different cosmos, within a different world, right? They no longer have the power over death, even if they still do in a material sense, even if we say we mourn and remember, but they don't get to decide the significance of it. Like when Hegseth and Trump say, we will kill you and destroy you. Those are just words. They don't have significance. And I know that that's hard to comprehend, and it almost sounds like it's contradicting what we said before, right? Because we do mourn, and it should have never happened. But at another level, though, this remembrance takes that, it wrestles it away, and it puts it in a different context, which is then unfolding towards a very different world.
I think it's part of the problem that empire has with sovereignty, that it can't infiltrate that space, that it cannot break people, that it can't, no matter how much it tries, through heinous things like torturing an infant, that the sort of circumscribing all parts of life, whether that's interiority or death and afterwards, that has not actually happened. Certainly not in Palestine, not in Lebanon, not in Iran. And I think that's part of the meltdown. That's part of the psychic meltdown. I think that's part of the infrastructural meltdown, is having to be confronted with the limits of what you've projected as an empire all around, and coming up against a dignified struggle and a dignified refusal to actually bend in those ways. I mean, political prisoners have always taught us this, right? So if we go to Walid Daqqa and sort of searing of consciousness and the ways in which he sort of insisted on the fact that despite the fact that he was circumscribed by barbed wires, that he talked about writing as a way to sort of go underneath the barbed wires and reach Palestine anyway, right? And I think this is the sort of, or the heroes that broke out of prison with spoons. We have so many examples of this over and over and over again, in which the possibilities of life and life making are not actually circumscribed by empires, being pissed off with any attempt at sort of showing sovereignty. Alex, maybe this is a place for you. You have a new piece coming out that you're talking about the theater of sovereignty in some ways, but I feel like this is a good place, because there are all these ways in which negotiations happen, concessions happen, and part of what Bikram's saying reminded me of that. But I don't know if you want to say a little bit about it.
So I've been, I think thinking about this for a long time, but I decided to write something in relation to President of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, in January, cutting off oil shipments to Cuba, and thinking about, what went into that decision, because since at least late 2024, early 2025, Mexico had been the biggest provider of oil to Cuba. That is this country that, because of that defiance, has been under a pretty savage blockade since the early 1960s. And it's already since Trump won, it's become extremely intensified. So just, trying to think through kind of like what would explain historically, politically, theoretically, her decision to essentially bend the knee to Trump's threats, and make the decision to stop oil shipments to Cuba. And so in the piece, I kind of go into the history of just Mexican history in general, and the consequences of sharing a 2,000-mile long border with the United States, and how that border even came to be, right, in the mid-19th century as a consequence of U.S. imperial expansion and plunder, and taking more than half of Mexico's national territory. And just thinking about Mexican sovereignty as it's strategic at best and Janus faced at worst, right? Like I think historically, different Mexican governments have refused to directly engage with the fact that they do have some sort of leverage over U.S. empire, even though it's asymmetrical and it's from a position of obviously lesser material, political, military power. But nonetheless, they do have leverage, and for a variety of reasons.
Seems to be what Bikram is saying.
Yeah.
Right? Is remembering.
Yeah. And I think we can explain it in a bunch of different ways, but one of the consequences is that it leads them into, the most progressive Mexican government in a generation, maybe since the 1930s, making this really shameful decision to cut off oil precisely at the moment where their longtime ally needs it the most. And within an international context where that international context, Iran and Palestine and other forces and developments in other parts of the world actually enhances the leverage and the power that Mexico has vis-a-vis U.S. empire. Theoretically, they have more space to do something so basic and fundamental, which is send the oil. And we might get it still. I hope we might get it, right? But this is, again, just thinking about how the history between these two countries from the very beginning, even before the U.S. stole half of Mexico's land, from the time of the very first U.S. ambassador was sent to Mexico, it was in the 1820s, it was very clear that Mexican sovereignty was up for the United States to have a say in terms of how it was expressed, the range and the limit of it. And from the beginning, there's been meddling. And so trying to historically understand what would lead to that decision to not send the oil. Now, what we've seen in Mexico is really interesting, that from the grassroots and the popular bases, that there's been a lot of pressure on the Mexican government to send oil. Like for civil society, it's been very clear what is at stake. And it's almost commonsensical that, yes, of course, we should provide oil to an island nation that is being blockaded and starved and strangled. So it was just an attempt to kind of think through and drawing on Bikram's earlier work, more theoretical work on what sovereignty is. And that I think it's really important to think, when we think about sovereignty in Mexico, it's not just an external relationship, it's also an internal relationship, right? So which is something that I've learned from Bikram's work. And in many instances, Mexico ceding its external sovereignty to the United States has allowed it to kind of reaffirm its internal sovereignty over parts of the country that they've long deemed to be interior frontiers or rebellious areas, right? And one way we see this in the 20th century is through the war on drugs. So actually different Mexican governments working with the United States, ceding its military and national security for the purposes of a so-called war on drugs, allowed the Mexican government to really brutally reestablish some semblance of state authority over places like in southern Mexico in the state of Guerrero, or in the Northwest in a place like Sinaloa or Sonora. So that's one way that that Bikrum, your work, Bikrum, has really helped me think through that the question of sovereignty Mexico vis-a-vis the United States is just as much interior and internal as it is external against U.S. empire. So that also explained, right? Like Sheinbaum we just saw recently with the execution of Mexico's probably most powerful narco leader. Anytime that issue comes up, it's a reminder that Mexico has ceded some of its external sovereignty to allow U.S. intelligence, U.S. CIA, U.S. military support to come into the country, ostensibly to wage some war on drugs, which we all know is not really about drugs.
So that is really, I think I want to like use that as an opportunity, because I think, Alex, like that, the challenge that we have is there's no easy road, right? I think this is the one thing that's there. And I think like the way, and I'm really eager to read the paper. And I should mention that Helyeh and I are working on a paper as well. It would have been good if she was here. We could have maybe talked about it, but I can talk about it a little later on. But this point around so there's a complicated road. So let me theoretically think about this, and then I'm going to come to your paper, because on one level, what is the challenge that states face coming out of imperialism? You find a bind, and Palestine's like a microcosm of this, right? The West Bank and Gaza. Because, this is the difference that I've been saying recently between decolonization and anti-imperialism. At the moment you seize territorial sovereignty, you find yourself, like Mexico is finding itself, within an imperialist world system. And those external relations hem you in, right? And if you challenge those external relations, you are subject to sanctions and intrigue and war, which compromises your sovereignty, as we see. So like in Gaza, they hold an internal basis of sovereignty, but nobody can claim that the authorities in Gaza exercise the same sovereignty that other states exercise over entry and exit into their territory, the definitional moments of sovereignty, components of sovereignty, right? But in the West Bank, where they do relent on these questions, they're not sovereign either. So you see there's a bind in each way. So like with the Mexican government, when you're speaking of this, like they do confront this architecture, this global military, intelligence, financial, even architecture. So even as we speak of the decline of US imperialism, we cannot overlook the power of Wall Street and the dollar Wall Street regime, although the Strait of Hormuz is rapidly, I think, bringing that into question, maybe in some ways, right? Not to get too ahead of ourselves, but we're seeing rapid movement, just like we saw in Yemen with the Red Sea last year. Now, the question that you're asking in the paper, which is really provocative here, or clarifying, in a way, like Mexico seems like a mirror of settler colonial America, but it's not. So like you're talking about how them going externally, having their recognition of their sovereignty be reinforced by the United States, and performing in the way that achieves that recognition. So we will not send the oil to Cuba. And you're saying that opens up space for a different internal configuration. Now you could imagine the reverse almost happening. Right. And I think in the paper that I would have wrote on Palestine and sovereignty earlier, that's the point I try to emphasize, is like the orders of sovereignty should have the internal as the basis in a way. Right. Now, that's not to diminish the relations between peoples as important to understanding kind of who we are. But you could imagine another world within Mexico where those internal relations ground a different power that can confront US imperialism. It can be reversed. But I think maybe there's something else also at play in a leakage across these two states, right? That those regions that the Mexican state has long sought to, say, repress or exercise greater control over, well, maybe that's in line with the interests of U.S. imperialism as well, right? So like, it's not like a conscious effort that the U.S. is saying, hey, Mexico, we're going to work with you and you contain these regions in this way. But in some sense, right, like those in Mexico who view those regions in that way, right? Or the forces, the class forces, the institutional forces, those would be the ones that have leakages into the United States anyhow, right? That do not have. So the question could be different, right? Like you could potentially, but I would still say the point is not that there's an easy road because of this imperialist behemoth that sits next to Mexico. I don't think it's easy for us to very quickly, I'm not one to say like Sheinbaum or Delcy Rodriguez that one can quickly say, okay, like that's it. This is a rejection of everything there because of the structural context and confines with which they find themselves. And maybe if our role as intellectuals at this moment is to think about the constant renewal of resistance and anti-imperialism, What would it look like if those internal relations that you point us to, Alex, if there was like a lateral, like that Lego movie, like if those relations, right, within Mexico, if they were put in motion laterally with those other histories that the Iranians are pointing to, right, and in a South-South mold. Now, that may not be possible. Maybe you do hit a limit, and then you understand the need to be tactical, but at least we're aware of where the choke points are, that it could be pushed in the Cuba, Venezuela, anchors that exist that are weakening or whatever.
Back to the question of conditions, but Alex, I'd love to hear more from you based on what Bikrum was saying.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think, no, I would never, I mean, we've seen this debate, I think, in a really unproductive way online, like, you know, people castigating leaders in Venezuela or Mexico and other parts of the global South in terms of not being ultra enough to satisfy online leftists, perpetually online leftists in the United States or the global North. But I think Bikrum, the way I end my paper is like precisely in the way that you just laid it out. Like what, and it goes back to the question that you guys, that you raised earlier, Lara, about like, what was the question about colonialism? Like, what if we just ignored colonialism?
What if no one sided with colonialism? Like
what if Mexico actually sided with the global South? Like, what if Mexico actually looked more South than North? And again, within this architecture of financial, military, imperial power that does have a lot of leverage over the country. But what happens, particularly when the way that the United States is trying to divide Latin America and between like the proxy right-wing dictatorial leaders that are going to come under this organization called the Shield of the Americas, which are a bunch of like right-wing lackey proxies. Mexico, it wasn't by accident that like Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil were not invited, right? Those are the three biggest, most populous countries in Latin America. What if Mexico looks south? What if they look south to Colombia? What if they look south to Brazil? And I think that is happening at the governmental level. I think there's people within the Mexican government who are thinking in this way, and maybe it is not an easy route. Like there are some it has to be carefully thought out. But one really minor cool way that I've seen in the last way that this is starting to happen at the interpersonal, like individual level, is the Iraqi national team for football played their last two matches to try to qualify to the World Cup in Mexico. And the 3 weeks before the Iraqi national team even showed up to Mexico, they played their matches in the northern city of Monterrey, which is like not like the most radical left-wing city in Mexico. It's actually probably one of the more conservative, also there's some radical pockets. For like 2 weeks before the Iraqis even arrived, like the Mexicans there were like so excited, like Mexican football fans were like, we are waiting for you. We are supporting you. They didn't like choose the other national, like they played against Bolivia last night. And you would think, oh, maybe they'll go like the pan-Latin American route and support Bolivia. No, for weeks now, you've had this really interesting emotional, athletic connection that's been created in this part of Mexico with the Iraqi national team. And it's been really cool to follow online and to see it through different media sources, right? There is an interesting South-South. It might seem like unimportant. It might seem minor, but it's also like the world's most popular game. So who knows? It might say something as well. No, for football, for soccer.
Oh, okay.
For
Sorry.
the World Cup. So like
the most popular game. So I thought.
Yeah. So like, which is soccer, right, Bikrum? Yeah. So not even close. So it's been interesting to see that, right? And this is on a broader scale. We've seen this type of South-South solidarity at the grassroots happen since October 2023, right? The problem in Latin America, as we've talked about before, I know I've talked with you both about this, is the question of how do you translate that South-South grassroots, politics of mutual recognition up to the higher levers of political power, right? But it is there at the popular level, and you can see it in even like seemingly insignificant things, like the way it just struck me to see the type of affective relationship that was being formed between Mexican soccer fans and an Iraqi national team. That when Iraq won last night and they achieved qualification to the World Cup, like Mexican fans were celebrating as if it was their own national team, right? So there's something really interesting there. Again, it might seem super minor, but for me, it was, and you kind of see that you see a similar reaction online when Iran releases these like these AI videos with the Lego one. Like people get it, right? There is a recognition there that can be built upon that I think is really interesting.
I think it's so important actually to move us away from it's sort of like the invitation you have for us, Alex, about that these are not insignificant things precisely because of what you both are talking about, is that if the ferocity of identifications or seductions or coercions or conscriptions into empire's narrative are there, these sorts of identifications in defiance of geography, right? And in alignment with a different social order and a global access, a sort of internationalist, anti-imperialist process. It's not by chance that it's Iraq that people are connected to, and that to be able to see what is happening today is a logical extension of U.S. empire's foray into, I've said this before, into the so-called Middle East and a reconfiguration of the region, that Iraq centers so much in this imaginary, and that people can see and re-identify and recognize that solidarity with Iraq means solidarity with the global South, means being anti-imperialist. I actually think we have to be attuned to what might look small, like you're saying, but actually represents something much bigger. And maybe this is the mutual recognition that Bikram is talking about, or where we started off, about what conditions would have to be for solidarity, for us to sort of recognize each other, to see that actually over and over again, despite the violence, and I think both of you have alluded to this, that's not us disavowing the violence. It's actually saying that there are multiple worlds that are being enacted at the exact same time. And what would it mean for us to continuously come back to the world in which folks in Mexico can be connected to folks in Iraq, to folks in Iran, to folks in Kashmir, to folks in Western Sahara, to folks in Cuba, as actually a uniting front against the same imperial logics that created all the violence against their peoples. Even if the logistics and the specifics are different in every space, it's the same machinery that we're up against. So I actually think we have to become better at looking at these small ways, because the global majority gets it. Like, we are not a minority in this. And I think that sort of focus is really important, because we can miss all the ways in which folks are connecting the dots, in which they get it, in which they understand that our fight is larger, and that actually, you know, celebrating each other on a South-South axis is really important to keep forging these connections.
Yeah, thank you both. I think, you know, in both of your kind of discussions here, like about the football team and about the multiple worlds here, Lara, like we can feel, I think you put it very well, right? Like, again, I don't mean to always go back to Marx here, but like the world to come is at hand, you know, like it is, I think, and it's important that folks feel that there's multiple worlds. There's this Epstein world that's here, but you know, within it and beyond it, something else is there, has been born, and is persisting, right? And I think, you know, there's and maybe to go back to our other friend, put the sticker up now, Fanon, he's coming back right now. But so, you know, that point I mentioned before, maybe I left a little underdeveloped, but this idea when you're saying like the Mexican team, or like speaking to Iraqis and forging these connections, when Fanon talks about the movement of the gift, you know, he has this really powerful kind of passage there. I'm going to plug my article, A World in Reverse. I worked with it, but he says, what was I created for? Was I not created to help build the world of you? You know, which is a very different relation, a gift-giving relation, than the move of conquest, which is not to build the world of you, but the move of conquest is, was I, that's like Enrique Dussel when he says, before I think, therefore I am, I conquer, therefore I am. You know, I don't exist to create the world of you on your own terms. You know, and Dussel will say, to create the world of you can sound colonial, but there's a way in which, if it recognizes the otherness of the other in their own world, right? And then there's a process of mutual learning, a rational way in which different worlds can come together to create something maybe new and beautiful, right? So there's a way in which, like, I think we're learning this right now, this Fanonian injunction in real time. And I think the Palestinians have put it on the table. Like, in Alex, you put a really powerful example of what's happening in Mexico and their response to this, that I think we should not sell short what the Islamic Republic has demonstrated. And what is the interiority? So, you know, Fanon is interesting. He moves between state and individual. So the interiority of self and helping build the world of another, right? But how in those mutual relations, we come to encounter ourselves at a deeper level and the other. So what is the Islamic Republic? There's an interiority to the Islamic Republic today that is shown to the world, that internal basis, maybe, Alex, right? When Trump is encountering right now is a shock, I think, that there's a people that you're encountering, there's a history that you're encountering that moves out of conviction and principle. Think about how different it is. The world that we have been brought up in, even as critical scholars, we are not supposed to be principled, even if we claim to be principled, right? And what I mean by this is, I'm not trying to blame us and beat us up, but this is all we've known. This is all we have known is expediency. In the end, I cannot live and die according to a principle because I need the expediency, the interest of my income, of my house, of my mortgage, because it could all be taken away from me, and then what? And then I have nothing to fall back on. So what are we seeing in the Islamic Republic? We're seeing this faith, right, from the Shia tradition of a justice to come, that will come, that one has to conduct themselves according to principle. So when Imam Mahdi reappears, right, that you are ready to stand with that. And this is an understanding of remembrance that we talked about from Karbala and Imam Hussein, right? Like their stories and their histories are really powerful. That is a qualitative basis of sovereignty, intangible, that they cannot reach, they cannot get into, just like they can't get to the missile cities on a material basis. There's something else they will never be able to access, right? And that's what's disarming them. But that opens up this other world too. It's opening something else. So what I'm trying to ask though is, like, I'm going to go back to Albanese again, but like everybody's going to think I'm obsessed.
This is a safe space for this.
It's just,
for Mark,
again, okay, it's instructive, and it's an invitation also. It's
Yes.
an invitation to Francesca Albanese. What would it mean not to condemn the Islamic Republic, but to stand in real solidarity and learn from them? To be humble enough to say, my engagement with the other doesn't only have to be from saving them or turning them from a child into an adult. And I'm sorry, that's where you're stuck if you don't get to that conditions question. All you can do is say, oh, poor Palestinians. And she's very important, but that's what we hear, right? Again and again and again. But what would it mean to say, wow, there are others there that are defending their land? Maybe I can learn how they're doing so. Maybe I should take seriously what is the condition of life that makes those missile cities possible. Is it just science? Yes, there's a scientific industrial base that is powerful. But what else underwrites that? And can we take seriously this question, not simply of watching the resistance, right? Not simply of watching the Palestinians, not simply of watching the Iranians, but of learning, of mutual learning, right? Of taking into analytical significance. What would it mean? So do we watch the resistance, or do we take their epistemology serious? What I mean by epistemology is, are they legitimate sources of knowledge or not? For people like Francesca Albanese, they're not. Because what the Islamic Republic says is immediately a lie, because you're seeking recognition from the imperialist. So you cannot even enter for a moment into learning about Karbala, Imam Hussein, the Mahdi, all these sorts of things, right? Or like we talked about with Sinwar. So there's this, so there is, when I said at the beginning, like everything is possible right now. We've not really been at a moment at this scale before, right? What the not just the Islamic Republic, I don't want to say it's only, but they have taken a stand that we need to recognize, right? And I think is it going to be responded to with mutual learning, with mutual recognition, with what Fanon says? What would it mean for me to help build the world of you, and for you to help build the world of me on different terms? That is the question that's before us today. Break out of this false solidarity that says, oh, I need to rush and save the Palestinians. What are we going to do for Palestine? What are we going to do? What can we do with Palestine? What can we do with Iran in relations of mutuality?
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, it's a confession of a fundamental supremacist version of the world, whether or not you say it. I actually think you using Albanese is really important, because people like her. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about identifications. People like what she says. She's nice. There's all these ways in which she has gone hard in certain positions. She has been sanctioned. She has taken hits. So I think actually using this figure of her as representative of something larger feels very important, because that's how we also practice breaking or divesting from identifications that are put in front of us on purpose, and ask the question of, what is it derailing us from? right? This over-identification with someone like Albanese is a derailment from something else, from these possibilities that you both are actually tasking us with, is saying that there's something actually being mobilized here. And that is part of the machinery of empire, is to mobilize certain methods of being, of relating, of engaging with the world, of what is proper resistance. We know all of these techniques. And yet I think there's something to be said about the specificities of Palestine. And because people are used to crumbs related to it, I always say this, and I say this as Arabs in general, this is the fight I have constantly with people. Like, we do not need to be okay with crumbs, because that is the entire machinery. Just because somebody is now saying the word Palestine or going hard on that, we still have to be very careful about what we're being conscripted into. And if we channel all our identifications or libidinal investments in one figure, we need to ask the question, in the sort of structure and infrastructure of empire, who is that actually siphoning energy away from? And in this case, it is about armed resistance and people on the ground. And I think part of what you're saying about the Islamic Republic is that if we go back to Alex's work about the war on terror, there's something fundamentally heroic in the defiance of not bending away from Islam in the face of an entire global regime and order that criminalizes Islam just as upfront. And I think actually we see that failing. Like, Hamas actually brought that into being. Hamas and Hezbollah in general brought that into being. Like, when I see somebody in Washington, D.C. after Tawfan al-Aqsa holding up a sign saying fags for Hamas, like, you've lost the fucking, everything's gone at that point when somebody can sort of make that distinction.
I think I was at that rally.
Right. Right. And we've seen this across the board. And I think we can look again, to go back to Alex's point about these might seem minor, but they're not minor because they represent an actual glitch and a fundamental coming up against what the war on terror was meant to be, what it is meant to actually force us to do, the action it creates in us. We saw the same thing right after Tawfan al-Aqsa. I was giving a talk and there was somebody in the room who was from Pakistan and sort of had her own critiques about Pakistan, of course, and then ended up saying, but when we started doing these mass demonstrations for Palestine, to be able to sort of do the call to prayer and in Times Square, there was something so liberating about that, to be doing it in the center of empire. And I think this is part of the confrontation and not the leaning away from, that there is something that is centering about Islam. And in this moment, what does that mean when we're talking about identifications or building new worlds or inhabiting worlds that already exist? Like, Islam is not a fucking minority position here in the sense of the global world order, but it does call upon us again, whether it's academics or sort of intellectuals or the way that we move through the world, is like all the ways in which we have been invited to move away from that. And armed resistance, of course, as the centerpiece of that too.
I think it's really, I think going back to, what both of you said and Bikram's point about decentering, I guess, to use academic language, right? Decentering knowledge production, right? And taking seriously the epistemologies that are being forged and that are fueling these resistance movements in Iran and in West Asia and in Palestine. And it's, that the hierarchy of knowledge production neatly correlates with racial hierarchies that have been created by imperialists and colonizers for a really long time. The struggle there's two things, right, that I think we should be aware of. As I completely agree with Bikram's call. I think the two things that we should be aware of, one is not allowing that, taking seriously the epistemologies of the Islamic Republic to fall into the hands of counterinsurgency theorists. Because the smart ones would actually be doing that already, and they're not. That's one thing that's really struck me. To see the Trump administration talk about Iran the way that they are so stupid and they are so ignorant, and that works in the favor of Iran. So I'm like, okay, maybe they're not listening to you, Bikram. So hopefully they're not going to take you seriously on that. The second point is doing that in a way that is motivated by intellectual and political solidarity, not by like academic careerism, because we've seen previous calls in academia to do something similar. And then that shit becomes branded and commodified by very specific, quote unquote, third world scholars who occupy privileged positions in their particular South Asian society, vis-a-vis London in the American academia, right? Like, and they defanged an insurgent revolutionary generation of people like Fanon, of people like Césaire. Like, what happened to Fanon in the 1990s and when I was in grad school, like the early to mid 2000s, like a complete defanging, right? So that's it. Like, how do we avoid that, right? Like, how do we allow like actual grounded political commitments and solidarity to fuel this rethinking, to fuel the taking seriously the epistemologies, to taking seriously these people's own frames of reference, political, spiritual, economic, in a way that doesn't kind of separate them, right? Because that's another colonizing thing to like kind of try to compartmentalize. But then how to do it in a way where it doesn't just like, and it might not matter because academia, and at least in the United States, is kind of disappearing anyway, but who cares? You know, who knows? But that's another thing, right? Like not allowing it to be branded or to become commodified and then to be defanged. So that's like, and that's just based on, we've seen this, right? Like we've seen this in the last 3-4 decades. So I think just cautionary things to be aware of, but maybe, like I said, maybe they're not listening to us anyway. So maybe we could just do whatever we want and see what happens.
I share your I guess view of the Trump administration. It's quite comical, right? But it's encouraging their stupidity, right? It's like and it's different than like earlier bouts of empire that had classical Orientalists like in their It's cabins.
Hard to believe they're stupid. Like it's hard for me to believe that they're actually this ignorant.
They're not even trying to find their Bernard Lewis. You know, they're not even like pretending like they have anything like the Arab mind or anything like that. They're just kind of like, we're going to kill and destroy you, not understanding what they're up against. You know, so I've been thinking a lot about this too, Alex. Like those we inherit, our inheritance comes from in many ways, do not live like us. We've been quite spoiled in some ways, you know, if you think about it. And I think to go to a crude Marxism that's helpful, the materiality of our circumstances in the moment of Al-Aqsa is providing the space for our consciousness to shift in such a way to to avoid doing what you're cautioning against, right? Because now we are experiencing what those we inherit the struggle from have experienced. Since when could you be an anti-imperialist in the United States and just be like, oh, I'm just going to think about my pension, I'm going to, et cetera. You know, these have been the questions. I mean, that's not me, but maybe it was, but I don't know, right? You know, like maybe when I got hired here, I was thinking about that, right? But now we're all like, we're losing.
I highly doubt that, Bikrum.
No, okay. But like now when we're losing our jobs and we're literally living in these in-between spaces between countries, like we meet on these virtual spaces, but we don't really know where we are. Like the materiality of it is doing something, because those we inherit from live like this, right? Like to actually contest at that level we started with, the conditions of imperialism, you know, it does invite certain censure and costs, right? Like, so, but like, was Fanon in the academy in this way? Was Karl Marx? Was Vladimir Lenin? Was Claudia Jones? Like, were they inhabiting these spaces in the way that we are? No, think about those we really turn to. We don't turn to Walter Mignolo as an authority on struggle, right? We don't. I'm just saying, like, we don't like, but we do. We like the people like a Cabral or them, right? They're actually attached in the question we came to earlier. Who are they accountable to? Are they accountable to a tenure process? Or are they accountable to a struggle and an organization? So I think that's the question. You know, as we engage different sites of resistance today, different sites of knowledge production, when we engage that, it's to ask, to whom are we accountable? Am I seeking to do what Kanafani says is being done to Palestinians? Am I seeking to engage and learn about Wilayati Faqih in the Islamic Republic in order to streamline that into my tenure process, right? Which is then going to fall into the problem, Alex, that you're pointing towards. Or am I seeking myself to attach my intellectual work, my knowledge work to real concrete struggle, right? So, and I think we are at a moment that's an invitation to bring us back to those who we've learned from, right? And that's been I think you're right, the times we went through grad school, that was a jarring thing. Those we were reading even somebody like a Gramsci, who was taken up so popularly, but Gramsci was in prison, like he was living a different life. And I'm not saying to fetishize that either, but I think there's a danger that happened from the 1970s to the 80s to the 90s, where intellectual work, even of a resistance, quote unquote, character, materially comes to be located in a university, that then those resources are oriented towards the reproduction of those institutions, right? Rather than being attached to real struggles. And I think maybe the last point I'll make on this is there's a question of incommensurability that I think even if the State Department seeks to study Hezbollah or the Islamic Republic, they will never really get it. It's like, when somebody jacks your work and doesn't cite you, you don't really mind, because you're never really going to get it, man. That's what you fall back on, because nobody can actually take what's rooted in struggle and experience in a certain way. They can take elements of it, but they can't really take it, right? And so when I wrote a paper 2 years ago on the struggle in Palestine, Two Logics of War, I remember going through U.S. military journals, and actually it was very different, Alex, when they would write about how Hezbollah in the 1990s and 2000s, the awe they had of Hezbollah, as a fighting machine and what they were capable of. But you could still see they couldn't plumb to the depths of who Hezbollah is.
Well, they would negate themselves, right? If they actually got to the core, they would self-abolish, right? Because they can't get to the primary condition. Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's one point else when you were speaking that I thought about is because what I think, and Lara, when you're talking about Islam, I think whether it's Islam in the example of Khamenei today, and what you hear from Helyeh when she's doing her reports, is that realization people had, that moment that Khamenei gave his life for Iran. Think about how different it is to how we were taught about the Oriental despot, right? That they're sucking the blood out of the country. But if that was the case, why would he give his life for the country? So this realization that happens. But what does that represent in the figure of Khamenei through Islam? But then we have a figure like Che Guevara as well. I think this question of where we're returning to is this question of a principled life. What does it mean to live a principled life? And I know we started there and we've come to that at times, and I think I was just thinking that, Alex, when you're saying they couldn't get there, it would destroy who they are. Because again, we are raised in societies where a principled life is impossible. Capitalism is oriented definitionally against a principled life. And so what we're seeing through these, when Che Guevara, and I keep bringing it up, but it's so powerful when he's like, don't just say good luck to the Vietnamese, join them on their path to victory or death, right? So there's a principle that you hold yourself to consistently and with integrity. I think that is what then encountering these other epistemologies in struggle can help us rediscover about ourselves and our own traditions, and trying to renew them in the places we are.
There's an example from when the South Africans invaded Angola in the mid-1970s, and the South African soldiers confronted the Cubans for the first time, who had joined in solidarity, right, in internationalist solidarity to defend Angola and the MPLA. There's a testimony from a South African soldier who's like, these Cubans are fighting cheerily till death. And we essentially saying we don't know what to do with them, right?
Right.
We invaded this country, we have overwhelming force. And then we meet this small force of Cubans who are there out of internationalist solidarity, who are fighting, quote unquote, cheerily till death, right? And I think it just reminded, when you were talking about the way the U.S. military advisors were talking about Hezbollah in the 1990s and 2000s, it's something that they can't get that, right? These settlers can't get that.
But I think also part of what you both are saying is the incommensurability of a principled life that's somehow free of risk. And I think this is the part, and it goes back to the question of sovereignty. This sort of fantastical way in which empire's mechanics might make somebody consciously or unconsciously believe in a way in which you can act in principled ways as an anti-imperialist and not engage in risk. And that risk is both psychic in terms of what we're willing to wager, but also could be material, as in losing one's job, because I think one of the other things is it's always positioned that somehow if you stay silent, if you just put your head down and go through to tenure, whatever, there's always the delay, right? And all of us have seen this. No one who doesn't take risks as an assistant professor is going to take risks as a full professor. They don't flex that muscle. It doesn't fucking work that way. But the lie is that if you put your head down, you're actually mitigating risk. But if we go back to us talking about the condition, is that if the condition is one that's built fundamentally on coercion, domination, and exploitation, that there's a disavowal that you're actually having to commit to every single day. You are already in risk, but there's a disavowal that you're engaging every single day, and actually a transference or to somebody else who becomes that target, right? Because that's the other piece here, is that our so-called colleagues that don't engage in this principled wager are also tightening the space in which those of us who do commit to that, not because we're so self-important, but because we actually believe in the struggle and every single day wake up and commit to that, or learn from the folks who are doing it on the ground and actually do believe that they have something to teach us, that it is a not just valid, but a wellspring of knowledge production, and has been forever. This is not a new story about people doing that. To go back to Ghassan Kanafani, is that brilliant exchange about this is a conversation between the sword and the neck. One of the things that I love sort of focusing on in there as a great example of psychic militancy is he understood the risk of engaging as an unbending militant in that exchange, but also recognized that he was always positioned and always already as the recalcitrant militant. So why would you respond to an Orientalist, racist person from the global north and soften yourself in that way? But because he already understood that you were in the realm of risk, because the risk was created by the condition of settler colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. So I think I'm so appreciative to you both for putting a fine point on that today. It reconfigured how I was thinking about that, even just from the side of those who think that they're not risking anything. Is that just to, again, go back to the structure itself, throws us into risk, whether we want to engage it or not. And what are the sort of various disavowals that are involved, and what targets do you create, both at home, quote unquote, and elsewhere. We're kind of just nearing the end here. I just want to give you all the space to close us out if there's anything else you want to say. And Bikram, if you have an update on Helyeh, that would be fantastic. We'll have her back, folks, and maybe we do a part 2 of this, because folks are really excited. I just want to tell you, this is the episode I got like the most sort of excited messages about. People agreed with me that this is a dream team coming together. So maybe we'll have the chance to do this again. But just any final sort of thoughts you all had?
I'm just hearing from Helyeh. Alex, if you want to go, she might be able to hop on just to the end right now, but just
yes, please.
I'm just hearing from her.
I just
turn the signal. Yeah. So I'm asking her to hop on, but just one sec. Give me 1 minute.
We have time.
No, I would just say thank you. I think as they would say in my family, I was part of this panel de coleada. I kind of snuck in through the back door. So, but I'm always appreciative to learn from you, Lara, and from Bikram. And I know we don't have much time, but I think you should invite Bikram back and Helyeh so they can. I want to hear more, because I've heard Bikram talk about this on other platforms, but really push this idea of how what Iran is doing right now is world historical in terms of the impact of waging asymmetrical warfare on a global scale that destabilizes the entire diplomatic and capitalist international order, right? So I think that would be really interesting. I mean, that's what I want Bikram to talk about, but I don't know if you can tell us in like a minute, Bikram.
I can. Give me 1 second. I can.
And we've got time. I just want to be respectful of your time, but we will do it again, because I love the folks who watch and the audience who demand to see part 2. But I'm excited also to hear what Bikram has to say as well.
Okay, I will. I mean, so again, like I think she's just, obviously everybody sees the work that Helyeh is doing on the ground, and I think it's like I think just to recognize that maybe just it's not about Helyeh as an individual, but we see like what people in Iran are doing qualitatively that will question of sovereignty, right? Like, so sovereignty has. And I think, like, Alex, I appreciate you saying the way maybe you're engaging some of the things that I've been thinking about recently, because it was a self-critique of myself as well. Because I had thought about sovereignty in a very Marxist lens, and I still do, right? But like mostly just thinking about like the question of force, because I think the post-colonial, decolonial turn put that away too much. Like it didn't come to the question of force, which is why, and I say this all the time, why when we were in graduate school, Alex, did we not learn about the Hezbollah Charter? Like in the 1980s, like it was the most profound anti-colonial document of our era. And yet we have to spend time learning about, I don't mean to pick on him but Walter Mignolo, maybe we should, but like this is the guy we're told to read for
No, we should pick on him all the time, I think.
Okay. But like
we have people we can always bring on, and then always people that we can go up against.
Okay. So like there's a question of force that I thought we needed to come back to, right? Because there was a dismissal of that sovereignty is the problem, right? And even there was a way in which that political power becomes a problem. That Sankara and Nkrumah, they lost their way because they got trapped within Western forms of the state, et cetera. And that minimized that the problem was imperialism. The problem was always that any project was never given the chance to unfold, not even from one day. Cuba, day one, you have a blockade and sanctions. Iran, day one. Why? Right? So there's a quantitative materialist edge to the discussion on sovereignty, right? Like, how do you develop the means to actually do what Iran is doing today? You know, and it's asymmetrical, but there's a level of parity we're witnessing that is just beyond belief, right? And I mean, I would just say, like, look at the missile cities and look at the images of the Shahed drones. And yeah, you don't want the State Department planners to see those, but if they can't do anything. They simply cannot get to the basis of this. It's changed the whole game of warfare. But there is a qualitative edge to sovereignty, right? So there's a quantitative component, how you defend your land with your weapons, with your organized political power and force. And what are you defending? We need to ask that question too. It's not sovereignty for sovereignty's sake, right? Nobody wants to have power for power's sake, right? There's something that gives rise to it that you in turn seek to defend and protect. That's the question. And on the other hand, Lada, the question you're asking is to ask people, what are you seeking to protect today? What are you afraid of? When the Law and Political Economy Project watches Helyeh get fired last year, and they effectively fire her, I remember I asked them this question. What were they afraid of? What are you protecting? Your right to research? To be like kind of funny, like research what? Like what do you want to research if you can't talk about Palestine in the way Helyeh is talking about it? What are we left with, right? But on a different scale, sovereignty is about the protection of something, right? Something really sacred in place and in time. Otherwise, why would we care, right? There's a reason that we want our resources to be oriented, to be recycled back into something. What we're seeing with Helyeh, not just with Helyeh, but on the streets of Iran, is the will question of sovereignty. You know, we're seeing right now what, Helyeh could have been with us today, but she's on the ground and she wanted to join, but I think the connection issue was difficult, right? But she's doing that work to demonstrate to the world what's at stake for Iran, right? They're on the streets demonstrating the will of the people. The will on the streets is to defend the sovereignty of the republic, right? To be able to defend a form of life that emerged, it has deep historical roots, but it also emerges in response to imperialism of 1953, right? So those are, I think, important points to just put in mind in terms of our comrade who can't really be with us right now. But the world historical significance. So, Alex, one thing we're working on in this paper, and I guess if Helyeh is unable to join us, ultimately we can come back, is to think about, again, to come back to, and I appreciate a lot of the point about maybe identification and maybe thinking through the work of somebody like Albanese, right? But if we come back to it, what we're thinking through in the paper is there's an appeal to international law. There's an appeal to something as a way to say, do not commit these slaughters in Palestine. You're violating a law, which ignores the relation between law and force, between law and will, right? It's an appeal to something abstract, but it reinforces imperialism in the way that they do it. And if it is premised upon, if your appeal to international law, whether it's in the Hague Group, right? If even this Hague Group that they're spearheading, and they have flowery language that's inspiring, where they're saying, well, look, we're going to have a new order coming into being, et cetera. But if the cost of that, if the premise of that is the criminalization of the Islamic Republic, you're criminalizing the very force that is behind the justice to come. So you see, we see this world in motion right now, in this world historical moment, right? Iran is enacting accountability, right? It is imposing costs on the genocidaire. So you see in the Strait of Hormuz, you see the lineaments of a different international order. What is imperialism if not the ability to control the flow of capital between territories? I just want to make one point here. People might think I'm going away from Lenin when I make this point, but I'm not, because Lenin's point is the export of capital, right? This is key, the export of finance capital. But it's still attached to the ability to overwhelm a territory through the export of finance capital that will impose relations of economic dependency. The Strait of Hormuz, what Iran is doing there is challenging that infrastructure where 1/5 of the world's energy flows through. And the Islamic Revolution challenges the basis of how oil revenues will be recycled, of how they will be attached to this or that currency power, right? So I think what we're seeing right now in the resistance offered by the Islamic Republic, in its ability to set the terms, we're seeing a force. We're seeing an actual force that can backstop a real law among nations, that can enforce a real international law, a real post-imperialist architecture. Now, it's not Iran's alone, because we know Ansarullah has been doing this. We know Al-Aqsa flood was this in another way, right? So if the Hague Group appeals to international law today, or a different type, by discounting the very force that is itself potentiating a future where the genocidaire is put in the docket, then there's no point to the Hague Group, right? But I think that's the dynamic we're seeing today, is we are witnessing a different architecture being built and born, right? And I think, and what I would just say on the asymmetrical war question, and I think we've danced around it in this discussion already, but like what I would say people should just keep their eyes on is the victor of this war will be decided in the Strait of Hormuz. Like that's all you need to really watch, what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, right? If Iran controls the strait, which it does, it clearly does, the United States has been demonstrated to be a paper tiger. And that's just a plain fact, right? So I think that's going to be one key element. But the other things that we're witnessing is, the systematic way in which they took out, and we all know this, the radar system and the eyes and ears of the United States in the region. Now that's anti-imperialism at its highest level. I'm sorry to say, because now you've changed the terms of warfare. Because warfare isn't just missile on missile. Warfare is also about the setting within which you fight, right? So that has been now achieved in a way no other force, I don't think, in history has achieved this against an imperialist power, at least from the South, on this scale, right? You haven't seen this. So this will have system-wide implications. This can overturn, if global South states have sovereignty on a territorial basis, but where they suffer is in between territories. They suffer on that international scale. This can overturn those relations, right? Militarily and financially. So I think that's kind of what we've been working on and talking about. But yeah, I think maybe we can continue doing so as well.
Yeah, I can't wait for that to come out. I think part of what I'm. Did you want to go, Alex? First?
One sec.
No, the way Bikrum was describing their critique of international law, it sounds very headed in the direction of like Benjamin divine violence, right? Like his critique of law in a capitalist society, but he's at the national level, right? The way that Bikrum was talking about this at the international level sounds very similar. It's really interesting. I can't wait to read it.
Okay. Yeah. One sec. Okay. Should I tell her to hop on?
Yeah, please. Yeah, ahla. Say ahla wa sahla. I'll just quickly say that I think this gets back to what Alex was saying earlier about Mexico and his piece that hopefully we can put in the show notes once it's out. But that being, it's always going to be asymmetrical warfare if we borrow from our comrade Bassel al-Araj and martyr Bassel al-Araj. It will always be asymmetrical. Being engaged in asymmetrical warfare doesn't mean you don't have anything to leverage. And I think this is what we're sort of thinking about and seeing. And we see this also in Lebanon too, with the Hizb, is like that is asymmetrical warfare, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean a weakness. That means it's asymmetrical warfare because of the way that obviously we see empire has constructed how it gathers its power and what's the type of power and force it uses. But there's always something to be leveraged. And I think that the coming together of this axis of resistance is a major leverage point also that we haven't really talked about, but really the strategic sort of coming together on a regional basis and saying, and I think, Alex, you've talked about this before in terms of Latin America, what it would mean if people unified against the imperial machine, that there is something to be said about all across the board saying fucking enough is enough. Like, we're just not having this type of world anymore. And as we sort of create something else, and that what that will be is we still don't know. And I think that's the other piece. It's still an emergence.
So she didn't try to call you?
Let me see. I will call. There we go. All right, actually, let me disconnect my pods because then we cannot hear. Can you all hear me?
Hello.
Salam, Azizam. Alaikum Basalam. Hi. I think folks can you guys hear Helyeh? Yeah. We're very
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. You all can hear?
Perfect.
Okay. Awesome.
Yes. I really apologize for being very late. I spent the entire day with a family in Minab who lost a 9-year-old son, and I was talking with the family and the sister who is 11-year-old and had a 37-degree burn. And it's been a very heavy day. So I thought I would hop on to both apologize, say hi, and maybe we can talk about the level of disaster, which I'm still shook by going to the school, seeing what happened, talking to the locals who witnessed what happened day one, and talking to the first family that we were able to report, because we want to make sure that our kids are not reduced to numbers. So thank you for having me. And again, I apologize for hopping on so late.
No apologies. And you've been here in spirit and in your fierceness and your commitment on the ground. And I think folks are very excited to hear from you. We will follow up and do it again in the way that does justice to you. But we're here to hear from you. Anything that feels important for folks to know, anything that we can uplift from the ground and from your work.
I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that. So we arrived this morning at around 11 a.m. and we went straight to the school where it was impacted. And what I witnessed was the fact that the school had 3 parts. The upstairs where the girls, it was the girls section. Downstairs of the school was the boys section, and to the left of it was a kindergarten. And just because I got the exact numbers of the victims, I want to read those to you. There were, according to local authorities, hold on one second so that I could pull up the numbers. According to the local authorities, they are still looking for bodies right now, but those who have been found and confirmed with their identity are 155 people. 120 of them were students. 72 of them were boys, because the boys were downstairs. And I'm going to tell you what happened. And 48 of them were girls. School personnel were 26. 20 of them were teachers. One of them was pregnant, who was killed. And 2 of the principals, and 7 of the parents included, because they attacked Tehran first, and immediately once that happened, they called all the parents to come pick the children up. And once some of the parents arrived, they hit the school. And what was devastating to learn for me personally was the fact that they hit the school twice within a few minutes. The first time, and today when I talked to Parastesh and his brother who has been martyred, Ali Asghar. Parastesh told me that when the first strike happened, they all went out from the classroom, and she ran to find his little brother, and she did, and she found him. And as they were trying to get out from the school, the second strike hit, and she doesn't remember what happened. And the parents told me that she was under the rubble for at least an hour, and she doesn't remember anything, but her entire body was burnt. She couldn't move, and the brother was killed, and the doctors indicate it was either from a heart attack or from not being able to breathe. And I spent the whole day talking about who Ali Asghar was and what he loved. And he was into soccer. He had a ton of, jerseys, and he was, in Iran, there is a derby, the derby in Iran, the derby's team are Persepolis and Istiqlal, and he was a big fan of Persepolis. And he was really good with playing soccer, and they showed me his motorcycles, and I talked to Parastesh about what she wants to do, and she wanted to become a lawyer, and she was incredibly smart, and she was incredibly kind. And I saw a lot of boxes of chocolate and little gifts that, the community had sent them. And I told her, oh my God, I love this type of chocolate that you received. You're so lucky. I'm so jealous. And once I left the house, she told her cousin to pick up one of the chocolates that I told her I love, and she passed it on to me. And the cousin said, Parastesh wanted you to have this. I hope that I can do justice to the life and to the dreams that have been taken from our children. And these are just some very raw thoughts, because I'm still driving. I'm in the car with their dad, indeed. They've been incredibly kind. They're insisting that we stay with them, despite how devastating the loss is, despite how heavy the grief is. They've been incredibly hospitable, getting us food, wanting us to stay with them. And right now, he's giving us a drive back to where we're staying. And I'm still very much processing it. But since I had a commitment, I wanted to use this opportunity to share some of my very raw feelings and thoughts with you right now.
Thank you so much for being, so we were just talking about being principled, and we were talking also about how this logic of violence is not abstract, right? You're talking about double taps, the same thing we saw in Gaza, the same thing we're seeing in the south of Lebanon, we're seeing now in Iran, but also so moving to hear that the other piece that was also similar is the incredible access to generosity and care and hospitality, like you're saying, that doesn't disappear with the violence. I think, Bikram, did you want to say something or ask a question?
Yeah. Salam, Helyeh. Thank you.
I can't hear you.
Oh, can you?
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Alex, can you hear Bikram? You can.
I can hear you, but I can't hear Alex.
Can you hear me, Helyeh?
Speaking about generosity while we figure out the voice situation, it reminded me Java, their dad was just telling me that because it's a small town and everyone knows the families who've lost someone. Ever since this happened, no one charges him for anything. No one gets money in return of anything. If he goes shopping, if he attends anything, if he buys anything, everyone is trying to just show up and be there and take care of these families. And what's been beautiful is that I've been also seeing a lot of volunteers, including, mental health workers, those who are trained in children's psychology, are here, and they go every evening. They go to the graves of the kids, and they play with those who remain, because there are some who lost a sibling or cousins, and they all go play at their graves every evening. And what is incredibly empowering and beautiful is how kind, generous, and how incredibly resilient they are in terms of, I asked them, how are you so strong? Javad told me, because of my daughter. And the grandma told me, and she also shared an anecdote about Helyeh who was killed. She told me just this past year, he saved his money with his other cousin and got the grandma a little cake, and went to showed up unannounced to surprise her for her birthday. And she was telling me how much they're in disbelief, but they, without me asking, they also talked about Azad. When I asked them, why do you think the school was attacked? Immediately, the grandma told me, because they were kids and because they're genociders, she said. Because they want to take out our children, because they don't want us to live, because they don't want us to have a future, and because they're a genocider, she said. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Hi, Helyeh. Salam, Helyeh. Oh, you can't hear me?
Keep talking, Bikrum, and if you want to type in because folks, it seems like folks can hear you.
Oh, you can't hear me. Okay.
The folks online can hear you. I'm the one who can't hear you. It's me.
Wow. Okay. I'll
yes. You can type. Well, you can talk for the audience and then type for me, and I'll tell Helyeh.
Okay. I can't type and talk at the same time, but I don't know if. Okay, so maybe somebody in the audience, if they could just maybe communicate this to Lara while I'm talking. But I think that the thing that Helyeh, what she's saying, I think speaks to what we were talking about. And I just wanted to thank her really deeply, because, when we're talking about like the martyrs and when we think about where it's going towards, but at the same time, these are lives that should have never been lost, right? Like, so we're holding both, like she's saying that they get strength from their daughter's life, and but how that those lives should have never been taken, right? Like how something else would have been possible. So her reminding us, her remembering who they were and what they could have been is something we should never forget. So we thank her for this, and just I wanted to let her know that, and let them know this is what we were trying to think through as it was, and it's fortuitous, like just to hear from them. To give us those stories, so in those acts of remembrance, but how that continues to fuel us going forward.
Thank you. And this is us being a comrade. So Alex is typing what Bikrum is saying. Bikrum, if you have a specific question for Helyeh, I'll say, but Bikrum had at the beginning of the conversation we were having was talking about life and sort of living in the ways that people insist on life and living in acts of remembrance that continue to fuel us. So when we started off, we were talking about the ways in which, what would it mean for us to commit to remembering the martyrs, to remember who has died, to remember who has given their life, who has sacrificed. And I think one of the things that you're saying, you're articulating the same version of that there are people that are doing that. It's not like they're not seeing the violence, but there are ways in which they're engaging in really moving acts of recognizing life and sacrifice and that this actually didn't have to happen, that there's a version of the world in which the conditions where Iranian children are paying the price for imperialism, just like children in Gaza or children in Palestine or Lebanon, doesn't have to be the case. Alex, did you want to ask anything or say anything? And of course, I can't hear you. Okay. So, Helyeh, is there anything else you might leave the audience with? I mean, folks are really interacting, are very grateful to you for bringing us these stories, especially as you're processing them in real time. I appreciate it very much. This feels like an act of love in and of itself and commitment to calling us right away. But is there anything else that you would leave the audience with, or you want folks to know and make sure that we're uplifting here?
I appreciate you all for creating this space and for allowing me to share these as I'm still going through it. The only thing I want to say, and it's because I've seen it, in mainstream media initially about this. First of all, they denied Trump denied initially the attack, and second, I've been hearing that there's a heavy presence of IRGC centers or spaces in the city, and this was one of them, or something close to it, and no one I talked to confirmed any of these narratives. They said that it's been over a decade that and one of them, I haven't confirmed this, but one of them said even in Google Maps the area shows up as a school. There is no way that this atrocity was unintentional and was a collateral damage. And why I say this is because multiple atrocities and war crimes took place on the same day. The school was hit twice, followed by a health center that was hit once, and then again twice. And one of the person I was staying with showed up at the health center, and she was there when the second strike happened. And they've been systematically from day one targeting civilian spaces with the intention of killing children, as they have done in Gaza, with the intention of destroying life and bringing death and destruction, as this is what they're rooted in. Their colonial existence is rooted in. And so these narratives to justify, and I'm not even going to get into how, the hierarchy of civilians in terms of someone who's been a child of let's say police officers, or a child of and I've even talked about police officers themselves, how it's under international law, it is unlawful to target non-combatants, even police officers that do not take place in hostility, engage actively in hostilities. So it's war crime after war crime after war crime. And the first day, I haven't to this day realized what the extent of atrocity and the level of and the number of war crimes that took place, and the number of lives that were taken. And I hope to be able to write about this soon, as I'm going through these families as much as they're willing to talk to me. And I spent most of the conversation with Parastesh talking about what she likes, just trying to just really distract her. And she kept telling me, no, Auntie, ask me questions. I do want you ask me questions. I want to share. And I was hesitant. I didn't want her to reveal the trauma. And so I tried to keep it about what she loves. And she was incredibly smart, beautiful, and kind. And as she couldn't move as she was in bed. And it was a very small representation of the spirit of our children. Of the children of Gaza and our homelands. And I don't know, I'm left with in awe and in rage. And I'm sure nothing but victory is awaiting us with this level of sacrifice. So I really appreciate you taking the time to listen.
Absolutely. نتشكر عزيزم. And Bikrum says, we promise we will carry their lives and stories with us forever. And Alex does as well. And the final thing Bikrum said is, these lives are what are at stake, their reproduction on their own terms and the best of humanity. So I'm so appreciative of you calling in, and we will follow up one-on-one as well. And anything you need from us, we're here to carry it forward, comrade.
Appreciate you all, comrades. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Send our love. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I mean, what a way to end. I kind of just don't want to say anything else other than commit yourselves to the struggle, folks. And that's what it's about. And people on the ground are doing that every single day, their lives and everything else. Bikrum, I can't hear you, but everybody else can hear. Thank you, everybody in the chat. We appreciate you. Hopeful there'll be a follow-up. And thank you again. I feel very moved. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Bikrum. Bye, everybody.